Hey there, CFC family and friends. I'm so excited about life groups, and I trust you have a great time together as you gather. Whether you are new to the Christian Family Centre or you've been coming along for ages, life groups of how we can belong together in Jesus' family, grow more like Him, and encourage each other. So have the best time as you meet together this week.
Hello life groups, welcome to your groups this week. It's great to be joining you and jumping into our groups for a new term, and I'm excited about what we're going to be sharing today as we are continuing what we've been doing on Sundays as a part of our series, looking at relationships, and specifically today talking about forgiveness and mercy, unpacking that topic together. And I'm really pleased to have a special guest here, Leslie Turner, here with Leslie, who's been a key part of our church for a long time, key volunteer here for a long time. You might know Leslie from her work with Pastor Bill's books. She's been a key person pulling those together, the editorial process. But what some of you may not know is a previous book. What started her writing journey is writing some books about your cousin Ken, Leslie, and really a dramatic, horrible event, unpacking a great injustice that occurred in your extended family life, capturing the details of that story. And the book was sort of the events we're talking about is the book, The Power of Forgiveness. I'm really looking at that topic of forgiveness, and so we're going to be hearing from Leslie a bit about that today, some of the events of the book. So Leslie, talk about what happened. What was the main event that happened through your cousin Ken's life that led to you talking about this topic of forgiveness?
Ken's daughter was murdered. It was 1993, June 1993. It was quite a I don't know. It was a very high profile case.
Yeah, it was in the news
quite
at the
time. Both here and in interstate as well. Like, you know, it got the headlines over there as well. It was his 22-year-old daughter was stabbed to death.
Parents' worst nightmare.
Absolutely, yes. At the time, Ken had been suffering chronic fatigue syndrome for several years, and of course, what happened to his daughter and the process after that of dealing with everything that had to happen gave him post-traumatic stress syndrome, like, you know. So he was not a well man.
So a horrific scenario,
yeah.
Quite gruesome, and in your previous books documenting that, it talks about the details of what happened, and it's gruesome, but then you also talk not about the actual event, the huge loss of having a loved one, you know, in the prime of her life as a 22-year-old being taken from Ken in such a fashion. But then also, you talked about the injustice through the courts and there not being resolution. And so part of the story, and what I was hoping you could unpack, is just how Ken dealt with that, and that was quite a remarkable part of the story, that obviously a journey of forgiveness, as the book title, The Power of Forgiveness, talks about. So tell us about that.
Well, the first book I wrote was called Halfway to Justice, and that was the actual, the whole story, the gruesome bits and that sort of thing. And The Power of Forgiveness came out of that one, because there were a lot of people who could not understand how he could possibly.
Well, that's the question, isn't it?
Yes.
How do you deal with something like that? Yeah, how do you forgive? That's right. In that instance?
Yeah, because he had done that publicly.
And so
he
came out. Yeah.
2 days after the murder, the Advertiser front page said, "I forgive."
Well, that's the question. Obviously, in hearing his story, the question is, you know, that, and you said other people were asking that. How did you do that? trying to come to terms. How did you actually forgive? So what did you unpack? What did he say?
Well, he hadn't been a Christian for very long, actually, after the murder happened, but he had quite a grasp on, you must forgive, like, you know, I mean, Jesus forgave us, all of us, you know, we were forgiven by Jesus, and by him going to the cross, like, you know, and he knew that. And that was important to him. He seemed to understand that's... And when something like this happens, I mean, the very first thing he did was pray all the way with the police to the morgue. He prayed, and God did give him the strength, because he was ill. He was quite ill.
Well, for you, I mean, that must have been confronting to be unpacking those events and then confronted with Ken's ability to forgive with God's help.
Yes.
And then, of course, you put yourself in that position and think, what would I do in that scenario? You must have been deeply impacted by his story and his
Absolutely.
reaction to that.
Yes, absolutely. It blew me away, really, because I had sort of had I didn't say anything like, you know, how can you possibly do that, which a lot of people did. Could not understand how he
thought it was wrong.
Possibly forgive.
Yeah, thought it was wrong, and you shouldn't do that.
Yeah, I mean, even Christians, you know, still couldn't believe that he'd actually done that 2 days after the murder.
Yeah.
And I suppose it is a bit sort of
confronting.
Yes, very.
For you personally, and I guess for us as well, we can't identify really with a story like that.
No.
But thinking about our own mini injustices, things that happen to us, hurts, and how practically we do that. What did God teach you about your own journey of forgiveness, and what have you learnt about forgiveness through that process?
Well, having been brought up in a Christian home, like, you know, I mean, I had I knew about forgiveness, and I knew it was wrong, not to forgive. As a child, you know, there were times when I got myself into real trouble at school, and, you know, I had to face the headmaster, and the headmaster said,
I can't believe that, Leslie.
Well, I did, and of course, because it had been reported to him, the things that I had done wrong, had been reported to him. You know, my parents were obviously had to be involved, and it was my mother who first said, you can't. Well, the headmaster told me I couldn't do what I was doing, because I actually punched a couple of kids in the nose. So. But she basically said, you can't do those sorts of things, like, you know, you can't react and retaliate just because somebody's done something bad to you. You can't do that. And so anyway, I mean, she talked to me for a bit about it, and I started to understand. Okay, so I got to a place where I decided sticks and stones were not going to break my bones. There were other things that I should have done better after that, like, you know, sort of retaliation by words and that sort of thing is just as bad as probably punching someone.
Yeah.
But
so you were raised with a strong moral compass, and to know that forgiveness is a key part of relating and being a social person, and obviously through the book, and, you know, writing a book on forgiveness, surely that means you became an expert on forgiveness.
Not really. I find one of the things that I first did was Ken actually gave me a book which was called Forgiving the Dead Man Walking, and that's an pretty awful story too, about what happened to a young girl, and she actually wrote the story with someone else, but it really impacted me big time. And so I started looking for those sorts of things, and I found there was lots of videos. People had done videos that were on YouTube and, you know, places like that, which I was able to look up and listen to and read, and I was fascinated by how people in really dire circumstances can, forgive and almost do it easily. Not they don't do it easily, because forgiveness is not easy for anybody.
No, they've found the key to be able to do that.
Yeah, but they seem to be able to find the key to it, and not all of them were actually Christians. And it made me think about, what does forgiveness really mean? And then of course there's the stories in the Bible, like, for instance, the thief on the cross. Like, how did Jesus handle these things? So, like, part of my research was finding out what forgiveness really means. And that was a fascinating journey in and of itself, like, you know. But and it did bring some things to mind that I had not forgiven.
Yeah.
And
so you've grappled with that in your own relationships, with your own family members and people around you of, hey, I need to do this in my own life.
Yes, exactly.
And you've obviously gone on that journey and made decisions to do that because of what going on that process.
Yes, exactly. So God had a greater plan for me as far as that was concerned. Like not just the fact that I was able to write a book and get it published, for that matter, because it's fairly difficult to do that. It's not a great thing, but we got through it fairly easily, and that was wonderful. But I came to realise that how much God's love for us is because He made a way for us to forgive. He made that way for us. Jesus carried it out, of course, on the cross, and I've never done anything like murder someone or do anything really bad. But nonetheless, it doesn't matter the extent of what you do. God is there to forgive you, but you have to access that. You're the one that has to come to realise that it's not doing you any good at all. Like, in fact, it's likely to do you more harm than good. Yeah. And it does do you more harm than good. And I think Ken, he recognised it. Possibly coming to the Lord as an adult, it was a fresh revelation to him, and not obviously he didn't expect anything like that to happen to his daughter, but almost immediately he was able to forgive.
Yeah,
and
amazing. And there's the initial response of deciding, I'm not going to hold on to this. I'm not going to let this be toxic to my whole life. I'm going to forgive. But then, of course, forgiveness is more than that, because the ongoing consequences are still there, aren't they? Right, and of course, going 5 years through the court process, and forgiveness is a daily. It's a daily thing. A daily thing.
Absolutely. I learnt that through research, which was Corrie ten Boom's story. Fascinating story of her time in a concentration camp from World War II, and after the war she was speaking at an event where one of the SS guys from the prison was in the audience. He'd become a Christian, and he couldn't wait to get to her, to shake her hand and ask her forgiveness for what had happened, and she had trouble raising her hand to shake hands with him. And while it obviously didn't take a long time, and all that sort of thing, it felt like forever for her. But she just had to throw herself on the Lord and ask God to help her to do that.
That reminds me of that story where Peter comes to Jesus,
yes,
and says, "How many times do I forgive?" And obviously they had a religious custom at the time of 7 times as part of their inbuilt justice system, which seems, like a reasonable amount. And Jesus, of course, replies back 70 times or 77 times 7 or whatever the number is, as if to say you forgive until you don't have to deal with it anymore because it's ongoing. And I think that's the challenge, isn't it? It's not a once-off thing. We deal with the consequences of injustice all the time in our marriages, in our family, in our relationships, where we're constantly confronted with people. That choice to forgive.
Well, the devil doesn't like you making choices like that, and so he'll push buttons and throw memories at you and speak in your ear and say things to you that have those sorts of things coming zinging back to you, and that's hard to deal with. So you have to decide when that happens, go straight to the Lord and say, please deal with this, please help me deal with it.
And I think that's a challenge for us, because just because we've forgiven in the past doesn't mean that we've got a clean heart, or doesn't mean that there's not things that need to be resolved. And I think that's a challenge of thinking, all right, is there still things that I've forgiven in the past that are still cropping up that I need to continually forgive that person? I think that's a huge challenge, and maybe a good place to land as we head into our discussion groups is just that, man, we need the Lord's help with constantly forgiving people, and knowing when to still seek justice and do all those things, but forgiving as Christ forgave
One
us.
other thing that I'd like to mention too is you need to learn to forgive yourself as well.
Yeah, it's good.
You really need to learn to forgive yourself, because it's no use feeling ashamed of things that you've done in the past, or guilt or anything like that about things you've done in the past, because they're done and they're dusted. And if you love the Lord, you know He's forgiven you. There's no need to feel that. So forgive yourself so that you can move on with your life.
That's great. Well, I think it'd be great to pray before we head into our groups that, about this whole topic of forgiveness. Let's pray. God, we just thank you for how you help us to forgive, and for this story and this book, The Power of Forgiveness, that it's helped so many people. And thank you for Leslie for telling this story, and for the example of Ken. And Lord, we know that we need supernatural help to forgive like Jesus does, but you've forgiven us so completely, and we thank you for that. Help us in our groups, we pray in Jesus' name. Amen.